Imagine a man walking alone through the deserts of Arabia. No army follows him, no kingdom belongs to him. He carries no crown, only manuscripts. He is said to have traveled farther than most men of his age could imagine. Through ancient cities, across forgotten deserts, and toward places where even local legends warned travelers not to go. His name was Abdul Alhazred. Some called him a poet, others a scholar. But eventually, he became known by a far darker name, the Mad Arab. According to the legend, he was obsessed with ancient civilizations, forgotten gods, and knowledge that human beings were never supposed to discover. And somewhere during his mysterious journeys, he supposedly encountered something that changed his life forever. A city buried beneath the sands, a city whose name would become legendary, Irem. But here's where the story becomes strange. Because the more we search for Abdul Alhazred, the harder he becomes to find. No confirmed birthplace, no surviving grave, no authentic manuscript, no contemporary historian recording his existence. And yet, his story is strangely detailed, almost too detailed. So who was Abdul Alhazred, and how did a man who may never have existed become one of the most famous fictional occultists in history? The legend places Abdul Alhazred in Sana'a in Yemen, a city surrounded by mountains, ancient trade routes, and centuries of Arabian history. Imagine Sana'a more than 1,000 years ago. Caravans arriving from distant lands, merchants carrying spices, incense, precious metals, and stories. Stories from Persia, stories from Egypt, stories from Mesopotamia. And among these travelers, a young man supposedly developed an obsession with the ancient world. While others studied religion, law, medicine, or poetry, Alhazred supposedly searched for something else, the forgotten. He wanted to know what existed before the civilizations of his own time. Who were the people who built the oldest cities? What did they worship? What knowledge had disappeared? And perhaps most importantly, were the ancient stories really only stories? According to the legend, Alhazred became increasingly fascinated with forbidden traditions. He studied old languages, ancient inscriptions, forgotten religious texts, and oral traditions passed from one generation to another. Eventually, he began traveling, but he wasn't traveling like a merchant. He was searching, and his search would take him into places where few people were willing to follow. Alhazred's supposed journey was not simply geographical. It was intellectual. He wanted answers, and the ancient world was full of unanswered questions. In Mesopotamia, he supposedly studied the remains of civilizations that had already disappeared centuries before him. In Egypt, he became fascinated by tombs, temples, and the mysteries surrounding the dead. But there was another place that fascinated him more than any other. A place whispered about in ancient traditions, a city of enormous wealth, a city of impossible architecture, a city that had supposedly been destroyed and buried beneath the sands. Its name was Irem of the Pillars. To believers, Irem was a real lost city. To historians, the subject is far more complicated. References to Irem appear in Islamic tradition, but the legendary image of a vast supernatural city is something that developed through centuries of storytelling and later interpretations. And this is where the story of Alhazred becomes something much more interesting. Because he wasn't simply looking for ruins. According to the legend, he was looking for Irem itself. According to the legend, Alhazred eventually found it. Not a city like any ordinary city, but something far older. Something that seemed almost impossible. The ruins were said to contain enormous structures, strange inscriptions, and traces of a civilization that should have vanished long before recorded history. And somewhere among those ruins, Alhazred supposedly discovered something. Not gold, not treasure, knowledge. Ancient knowledge. Knowledge concerning beings that were said to exist long before humanity. This was the moment, the legend says, that everything changed. Because Alhazred no longer wanted merely to understand history. He wanted to understand what existed beyond it. And according to the mythology, he began recording everything he discovered: names, symbols, rituals, ancient entities, and stories about beings whose existence challenged everything humanity believed about its own place in the universe. These writings would eventually become associated with the most infamous fictional book in horror literature, a book supposedly so dangerous that even reading it could destroy the mind. The book would later be known as the Necronomicon. But what exactly was the Necronomicon? According to the mythology, it wasn't simply a book of spells. It was something much darker. A collection of forbidden knowledge about ancient beings, cosmic forces, and things humanity was never meant to understand. The supposed original title was Al-Azif, and according to the fictional history, this was the name given to the work by Al-Hazred himself. Later, it was supposedly translated into Greek and became known as Necronomicon. The name sounds ancient, the history sounds ancient, the translations sound ancient, the references to scholars and manuscripts sound ancient. And that's exactly what makes the story so effective, because the book was designed to feel real. It was given a history, it was given an author, it was given translators, it was given different editions, it was given a trail through history. But there is a problem, a very big problem. There is no genuine ancient manuscript, no verified Arabic original, no medieval copy, no historical chain of ownership, and no evidence that Abdul Alhazred ever wrote it. So where did all of this come from? There is something fascinating about the name itself, Abdul Alhazred. It sounds Arabic, ancient, authentic. But scholars have debated whether the name even follows conventional Arabic naming patterns. And that gives us our first major clue, because Abdul Alhazred was never designed to survive inside an academic history book. He was designed to survive inside your imagination. The name was created to sound like someone who could have existed, someone you might discover in a forgotten manuscript, someone whose grave might be somewhere beneath an old city, someone whose writings could theoretically be sitting in a forgotten library. And that is precisely what makes the character so disturbing. You don't need to believe in monsters to find the story frightening. You only need to wonder for a moment, what if? Now, stop for a moment. We have a mysterious Arab scholar, a detailed biography, a journey across the ancient world, a legendary lost city, a forbidden manuscript, a mysterious death. It sounds like history, but where are the sources? Where are the manuscripts? Where are the contemporary historians? Where are the archaeological records? Where is the man? This is where our investigation takes a very unexpected turn, because when historians search for Abdul Alhazred, they don't find an obscure medieval scholar. They find something else, a trail that leads not to 8th century Arabia, but to 20th century America. And at the end of that trail is a writer obsessed with cosmic horror, ancient civilizations, forbidden knowledge, and the fear that humanity may not be alone in the universe. His name was Howard Phillips Lovecraft, and suddenly the entire story changes. And now we have to ask the question that changes everything. Was Abdul Alhazred really a forgotten Arab sorcerer, or was he a character created by someone who understood exactly how to make fiction look like history? Because if Al-Hazred never existed, then who created his biography? Who invented Irem? Who created Al-Azif? Who built the history of the Necronomicon? And why did so many people later believe that the book might actually exist? The answer takes us into the mind of one of the most influential horror writers of the 20th century. But before we meet him, we need to understand the world that created the legend. A world where ancient myths, modern science, and fear of the unknown were beginning to collide. And somewhere in that world, a writer was about to create a man who never existed, Abdul Alhazred. There is a strange rule when investigating a mystery. Sometimes, the most important person isn't the person you're looking for. For centuries, the legend tells us, Abdul Alhazred wandered across Arabia. He studied forgotten civilizations. He discovered forbidden knowledge. He wrote a book that supposedly terrified generations. But there is a problem. Alhazred was never a real medieval scholar. There was another man sitting thousands of miles away in a very different world, writing his story. His name was Howard Phillips Lovecraft, born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1890. Lovecraft would become one of the most influential writers in the history of cosmic horror. But he didn't simply invent monsters. He invented histories, he invented books, he invented authors, he invented fragments, translations, lost manuscripts, and references to events that never happened. And among all of his inventions, one name would become particularly powerful: Abdul Alhazred, the fictional Arab scholar who would eventually become the supposed author of the most infamous fictional book in horror literature. Lovecraft grew up far from the deserts of Arabia. His world was Providence, Rhode Island. Old houses, ancient-looking streets, libraries, books, and an imagination that seemed to live partly in another century. He became fascinated with the past, not only history, but mythology, ancient civilizations, Gothic literature, supernatural stories, and the fear of discovering something that human beings were never meant to know. This distinction is important. Lovecraft's horror was rarely about a simple monster. His greatest fear was the discovery that humanity was insignificant, that civilizations could rise and disappear without the universe caring, that the world humans understood might represent only a tiny fraction of reality. And this philosophy would eventually shape Abdul Alhazred, because Alhazred wasn't simply a fictional magician. He was a fictional researcher, a man who supposedly went looking for answers and found answers he couldn't survive. Now comes Lovecraft's greatest trick. He understood something that many writers never fully understood. If you tell someone, "I invented this book," the illusion disappears. But what if you give the book a history? What if you say it was originally written in another language? What if it was translated, copied, hidden, banned, lost, rediscovered, translated again? Suddenly, fiction begins to feel like archaeology, and Lovecraft used exactly this technique. He created references to fictional books, fictional scholars, and fictional translations. The Necronomicon wasn't simply presented as a mysterious book, it was given a past. And Abdul Alhazred became the man standing at the beginning of that imaginary history. This was more than storytelling, it was world building, before the term even existed. According to Lovecraft's fictional history, Abdul Alhazred originally called his book Al-Azif, and that name was itself designed to sound mysterious. The supposed work was described as a collection of forbidden knowledge, ancient beings, forgotten civilizations, strange rituals, and terrifying truths about the universe. But here's something important. There is no ancient Arabic manuscript called Al-Azif waiting somewhere in a forgotten library. There is no authenticated medieval copy. There is no archaeological discovery that proves the book existed. The book's entire history belongs to Lovecraft's fictional universe. Yet Lovecraft wrote about it as though it were a genuine historical artifact. And this is what made the story so powerful. He didn't ask his readers to believe in a monster. He asked them to believe in a document that supposedly existed before they were born, a document that someone, somewhere, might still possess. And that psychological trick changed everything. Later, the fictional book would become known as the Necronomicon, and this name would become far more famous than Lovecraft could ever have imagined. The book appeared repeatedly through his stories. Sometimes it was hidden inside libraries, sometimes mentioned by scholars, sometimes consulted by characters who quickly discovered that some knowledge comes with a terrible price. But Lovecraft did something clever. He rarely explained everything. He left gaps, fragments, references, names, hints, and the human imagination filled in the rest. That is why the Necronomicon became so convincing. There was never enough information to completely understand it. But there was always enough to make you wonder if someone else knew more. And that uncertainty became the foundation of the legend. But why? Did Lovecraft choose an Arab scholar? Why not a European monk? Why not an Egyptian priest? Why Abdul Alhazred? Part of the answer lies in the atmosphere Lovecraft wanted to create. To his readers, the Middle East represented an ancient world of ruins, deserts, forgotten civilizations, and mysterious traditions. Lovecraft used these cultural images as raw material for his fictional mythology. Today, we can recognize that some of these portrayals were shaped by the Orientalist attitudes of his era, and that is an important part of understanding the character. Al-Azred wasn't created to be a historically accurate portrait of an Arab scholar. He was created to function as a mysterious literary artifact, a name that sounded like it had survived from a distant past. And it worked. Perhaps too well. Lovecraft had created something more powerful than a monster. He had created a false memory, a fictional history that felt as though it had always existed. Readers began encountering the same names in different stories, the same books, the same ancient beings, the same locations. The fictional universe began connecting with itself. And the more connections appeared, the more believable it became. Imagine discovering an old book and seeing a strange name. Then you find another book written decades later, and that same name appears again. Then another and another. Eventually, you might begin wondering whether the author invented the name or merely discovered it. That was Lovecraft's genius. He made fiction behave like history, and Abdul Alhazred was at the center of the illusion. And now, we reach the first major revelation. The mysterious Arab scholar didn't come from an ancient manuscript. He didn't come from an archaeological discovery. He didn't emerge from a forgotten medieval chronicle. He came from the imagination of a writer who understood that the scariest stories don't always need to look fictional. Sometimes, the most frightening thing is a book that appears real, a name that appears historical, a story that seems to have existed before you discovered it. Abdul Alhazred was never the man who discovered the Necronomicon. He was the man Lovecraft invented to make us believe that the Necronomicon had a history. But then another question appears. If Lovecraft invented Al-Azred, why did he create such an elaborate biography? Why Sana'a? Why Arabia? Why Irem? Why the mysterious journeys? Why the strange death? And most importantly, why did Lovecraft himself keep expanding the mythology? To answer that, we have to go deeper into the legend itself, because the story of Al-Azred was only beginning. There are books that change the world, books that preserve the knowledge of civilizations, books that survive wars, fires, and the collapse of empires. But there is another kind of book, a book that becomes famous, not because people have read it, but because people believe they shouldn't. For generations, readers have heard whispers of a mysterious manuscript called the Necronomicon, a book supposedly containing forbidden knowledge, ancient names, forgotten gods, and secrets about forces that existed long before humanity. And at the beginning of this strange story stands one name, Abdul Alhazred, the mysterious Arab scholar who supposedly wrote the original manuscript. But there's something we now know that the people inside Lovecraft's stories didn't. The book doesn't exist. The manuscript doesn't exist, and Abdul Alhazred never existed. Yet somehow, the Necronomicon became so convincing that people eventually started looking for it. So how did a completely fictional book become one of the most famous forbidden books in modern culture? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. According to Lovecraft's fictional history, the book was not originally called the Necronomicon. Its supposed original title was Al-Azif. And even that name has a story. Lovecraft described it as a strange expression associated with the sound of insects heard at night, a sound that ancient people could interpret as something supernatural. Imagine walking alone through the Arabian desert after sunset. The heat has disappeared, the world is silent, and then you hear it, a distant sound coming from the darkness. You don't know where it begins, you don't know where it ends, and because you don't understand it, your imagination gives it meaning. According to the mythology, Al-Azred became obsessed with exactly this kind of mystery. He wanted to understand what ancient people had heard, what they had seen, and what they believed was hiding behind the natural world. Eventually, he supposedly began writing it all down. The result was Al-Azif, a manuscript that would later become something much more infamous. But Lovecraft didn't stop there. He gave the fictional manuscript a history. According to his invented chronology, Al-Azif was eventually translated into Greek, and with that translation came a new name, Necronomicon. The name itself sounds ancient, almost archaeological. It feels like something discovered on a forgotten stone tablet. And that's exactly what Lovecraft wanted. The book needed to sound as though it had existed long before his own stories. So he created a chain of transmission, an original author, a translator, later copies, historical figures who supposedly encountered it, libraries where copies were allegedly hidden, authorities who supposedly tried to suppress it, and eventually, lost editions. This was an incredibly effective literary technique because Lovecraft wasn't simply telling readers, there is a terrifying book. He was telling them, there was a terrifying book. And that difference changes everything. A monster can be fictional, but a historical document feels different. So, what was supposedly inside the Necronomicon? Lovecraft never gave us a complete answer. And that's important. The book is frightening because it remains incomplete. Across his stories, we hear fragments, references to ancient beings, strange names, forbidden rituals, lost civilizations, and knowledge about forces that existed before humanity. But Lovecraft understood that explaining too much would destroy the mystery. So he gave readers pieces, never the whole puzzle. One character might mention a passage, another might discover a page, a scholar might recognize a name, and somewhere else, another story would reveal another fragment. The result was fascinating. Readers began constructing the book themselves. Everyone could imagine what the missing pages contained. And sometimes what we imagine is much more frightening than anything a writer could actually describe. At the center of Lovecraft's mythology were beings humanity could never truly understand. They weren't simply demons. They weren't traditional gods. They were something far stranger. Ancient entities existing beyond ordinary human history. And perhaps the most famous was Cthulhu, a name that would eventually become synonymous with Lovecraftian horror. But Cthulhu was only one part of a much larger mythology. Lovecraft imagined a universe where humanity was not at the center, where the stars were older than civilization, where beings could exist for millions of years without even noticing humanity. And the Necronomicon became a fictional doorway into that universe. The terrifying idea wasn't, a monster might attack us. What if the universe is filled with things that don't even know we exist? And suddenly, the book became more than a horror prop. It became a symbol of forbidden cosmic knowledge. Then something happened that Lovecraft probably could never have predicted. People started asking, where can I get a copy? At first, the answer was obvious. There was no copy. There was no original. There was no ancient Arabic manuscript. The Necronomicon existed only inside Lovecraft's fictional universe. But as the stories spread, the question became more serious. Readers began searching libraries. Collectors searched bookstores. Some people claimed they had discovered copies. Publishers eventually produced books using the name. Some were presented as occult texts. Others were sold as supposed translations. And the myth began developing, a life of its own. This is where fiction crosses into something fascinating. The Necronomicon didn't become famous because it was real. It became famous because enough people wondered whether it might be. And now, we enter one of the strangest chapters of the Necronomicon story. Because once a fictional book becomes famous, someone will eventually try to make money from the myth. Real books began appearing claiming to be the Necronomicon. Some were obvious works of fiction. Some were occult-inspired publications. Others were marketed in ways designed to make buyers wonder whether they had found the real thing. But none of this proves that Lovecraft's Necronomicon existed. Quite the opposite. It demonstrates how powerful the fictional mythology had become. The original idea was created on paper, but eventually people were physically buying books because they wanted to believe the legend was real. The fake book was becoming a real object. And that distinction is incredibly important because now we are no longer talking only about literature, we're talking about mythology. So let's stop and separate fact from fiction. The Necronomicon is not an ancient Arabic manuscript. There is no historical evidence that Abdul Alhazred wrote it. There is no verified medieval copy. There is no lost original waiting to be discovered. The Necronomicon was created by H.P. Lovecraft. But that revelation doesn't make the story less interesting. It makes it more interesting, because Lovecraft accomplished something that very few writers ever achieve. He created a fictional object that escaped the boundaries of fiction. He gave it an author, a language, a translation history, a chain of ownership, a mythology. And most importantly, he gave people a reason to wonder. Could such a book exist? Could something have been lost? Could ancient civilizations have known something we don't? The answer is no. But the question has survived, and perhaps that was Lovecraft's greatest creation. Damascus. The year 730 AD. For years, Abdul Alhazred had been searching. He had crossed deserts, studied ruins, explored ancient civilizations, and according to the legend, he had written a book containing knowledge that no human being should possess. But now, his journey was coming to an end, not with a war, not with an execution, not with an illness, but with something far more terrifying. Because according to the story, Abdul Alhazred simply disappeared, and the strangest part, it supposedly happened in broad daylight. There were witnesses, people were nearby, the city was alive around him, and yet something invisible was about to tear the man from the world. Lovecraft's fictional account claims that Alhazred was seized by an invisible creature and devoured before a horrified crowd. But here's the question that makes this story so disturbing. If the monster was invisible, how could anyone know what actually happened? And if nobody could see it, what exactly did the witnesses see? The story sounds impossible, and that's exactly why it became so memorable. According to Lovecraft's fictional history, Alhazred was attacked by something that could not be seen. No recognizable body, no visible face, no obvious weapon, only the consequences. Imagine standing in the middle of a crowded street and suddenly hearing screams. People run backwards, someone falls, others stare at empty air. Something appears to be moving, but nothing is there. You see dust being disturbed, you hear something, but your eyes find nothing. And then, the screaming stops. The legend says, this is what happened to Alhazred. He was supposedly seized and devoured before a large number of witnesses. But notice something important. Lovecraft didn't describe the creature in detail. He didn't give it a face. He didn't give it a body. He didn't explain its origin. He simply made it invisible. And psychologically, that is much more frightening. Because once the monster has no shape, your imagination creates one. And then there was nothing. No body, no funeral, no grave that could be verified. Just a missing man. But this was no ordinary disappearance, because Alhazred wasn't simply a traveler. He was supposedly the author of the most dangerous manuscript in existence. And suddenly, the author was gone, which created a perfect mystery. If the book was real, perhaps something had silenced him. If the book was dangerous, perhaps he had discovered something that eventually came for him. And if the supernatural explanation was false, then perhaps the truth was even more ordinary. Maybe Alhazred died, maybe someone killed him, maybe the story of his death was invented later. But Lovecraft chose something else. He chose the impossible. And this is where his fictional history becomes especially clever. He didn't give readers one definitive explanation. He gave them rumors, conflicting stories, different accounts, uncertainty, just like real history. And here, Lovecraft added another layer. He claimed that the story of Alhazred's death was recorded by a supposed medieval biographer named Ibn Khaldun. At first glance, this sounds convincing. A medieval scholar, a historical biography, a named source. Exactly the kind of detail that makes a legend sound authentic. But there is a fascinating trick hidden here. Ibn Khaldun was a real historical figure. He was a 13th century historian, famous for writing biographical material. Lovecraft took that real historical name and placed it inside his fictional history, and suddenly, the legend gained credibility. This is one of the most sophisticated techniques Lovecraft used. He mixed real history with fictional history. Real places, real scholars, real cities, real time periods, and fictional people, fictional books, fictional events. The boundaries became difficult to see. And that's exactly what made the Al-Azred legend so convincing. Think about what Lovecraft had done. He had created a fictional Arab poet, then placed him in real cities. He gave him real historical surroundings. He gave him a believable era. He gave him journeys. He gave him a book. Then he created a supposed history of that book. And finally, he attached the story to a real historical scholar. This is no longer just a scary story. It resembles a historical investigation. You can imagine a curious reader opening an old encyclopedia and asking, who was Abdul Alhazred? Then finding a reference to the Necronomicon, then another reference to Irem, then another to Al-Azif, and suddenly the fictional world begins feeding itself. The reader thinks there must be something behind this, but there isn't. There was only one writer, one imagination, and a fictional character who had been given a remarkably convincing past. But now, another question. Why did Lovecraft choose such a horrific death? Why not simply say Al-Azred died peacefully? Why not give him a grave? Why not tell us where he was buried? Because that would have ended the mystery. A grave creates an ending. A body creates evidence. A documented death closes the story. But disappearance? Disappearance keeps the door open. Maybe he died. Maybe he escaped. Maybe something found him. Maybe something followed him. And this is why the disappearance matters. Al-Azred doesn't receive a traditional ending. His story simply stops. And when a story stops without an explanation, the audience continues it. For centuries, that is how legends survive. Not through answers, but through unanswered questions. And Lovecraft understood this perfectly. But the most important thing didn't die with Al-Azred. His book supposedly survived. According to Lovecraft's fictional history, Al-Azif eventually traveled beyond Arabia. In the 10th century, it was supposedly translated into Greek and given the name Necronomicon. Later, another translation supposedly appeared in Latin. Then, the fictional book was allegedly suppressed. Copies were supposedly destroyed. Others disappeared. Some were rumored to remain, hidden in libraries. And with every disappearance, the legend became stronger. Because a book that survives is interesting, but a book that almost survives is unforgettable. The Arabic original was supposedly lost. The Greek version was supposedly destroyed. Later copies were supposedly hidden. And suddenly, the Necronomicon became a book that everyone had heard about, but nobody could prove existed. That was the perfect condition for a legend to survive. And this brings us to the final mystery. If Abdul Alhazred was fictional, then every detail surrounding his death was fictional too. The invisible creature, the witnesses, the disappearance, the mysterious biography, all of it came from the mind of Lovecraft. But here's the remarkable part. Lovecraft didn't hide the trick. In private letters, he admitted that the Necronomicon and Abdul Alhazred were inventions. He even described the collaborative game of creating a convincing fictional mythology with fellow writers. And yet, the mythology continued. People kept asking if the book was real. Lovecraft himself received inquiries about its reality. That means the illusion had succeeded. A fictional author had acquired a fictional biography, and a fictional book had acquired a fictional history. And now, there was only one thing left for the legend to do: escape its creator. Abdul Alhazred was supposed to disappear in 738, but he didn't, not really, because the man was fictional. And fictional characters don't need bodies to survive. They need stories. The Necronomicon was never found, because there was nothing to find. But the idea of it became real. Real enough to inspire books, real enough to inspire artists, real enough to appear in films, games, music, and modern horror. The strange thing isn't that people believed in a fictional book. The strange thing is that Lovecraft understood exactly how to make fiction feel like memory. He created a man who seemed to have lived, a book that seemed to have been lost, and a death that seemed to have been witnessed. But there is still one final question. Why? Why would a writer go to such extraordinary lengths to make a fictional Arab poet look like a real historical figure? The answer takes us beyond Abdul Alhazred. It takes us into Lovecraft's greatest invention, a fictional universe that would eventually become larger than its creator. Abdul Alhazred disappeared in 738, but his story didn't. Because the man was fictional, while the myth became real. And behind that myth was a writer who had discovered something extraordinary. You don't have to create a real monster. You only have to make people believe that someone, somewhere, once saw it. And Lovecraft did exactly that. For 4 parts, we followed the trail of a man who never existed. A mysterious Arab scholar who supposedly wandered across Arabia. A man who supposedly discovered forbidden knowledge. A man who supposedly wrote the Necronomicon. And finally, a man who supposedly died in the streets of Damascus in the year 738. But now we have reached the end of the trail. And the final destination isn't Damascus, it isn't Arabia, it isn't an ancient library, it's a small room in 20th century America. Because behind Abdul Alhazred there was another man, a real man, a writer, a dreamer, a man who spent years building an imaginary universe so convincing that some readers eventually wondered whether parts of it might actually be true. His name was H.P. Lovecraft. And the strangest part of the entire story is that Lovecraft never intended Abdul Alhazred to become what he eventually became. He was simply a name created for a childhood game that would eventually grow into one of the most famous fictional myths in horror history. The story of Abdul Alhazred actually began long before the Necronomicon. According to Lovecraft's own recollections, the name appeared during his childhood. He had been fascinated by the stories of the Arabian Nights. He imagined himself as an Arab scholar and supposedly invented the name Abdul Alhazred for himself. Think about that. The terrifying occultist we now associate with forbidden books, ancient civilizations, and cosmic horror began as a childhood fantasy. There was no ancient sorcerer, no secret manuscript, no lost city, no supernatural encounter, just a young boy with an extraordinary imagination. And this may be the most fascinating part of the entire story, because the legend didn't begin with evil. It began with imagination. A fictional name, created during childhood, would later become the name of a fictional author who supposedly wrote the most dangerous book in Lovecraft's universe. And Lovecraft would keep returning to that name for years, until eventually he gave it a history. Years passed, the child grew older, the name didn't disappear. Instead, Lovecraft began incorporating it into his stories, and slowly, Abdul Alhazred stopped being just a strange name. He became a person, a poet, a traveler, a scholar, a man who had supposedly witnessed things no ordinary human could explain. This is how fictional mythology grows. You begin with one detail, then another, then another. A name becomes a character, the character gets a biography, the biography gets locations, the locations get history, and eventually, the fictional world begins to feel larger than its creator. Lovecraft understood this instinctively. He didn't need to explain everything, he only needed to leave enough clues. A passing reference here, a mysterious name there, an ancient book mentioned in another story, and suddenly, readers could connect the pieces themselves. Abdul Alhazred was becoming real inside the imagination of his audience. Then came the book, the Necronomicon. Lovecraft needed a source for the forbidden knowledge appearing throughout his stories, so he gave that knowledge a fictional home, a book, written by Abdul Alhazred. And suddenly, everything connected. The mysterious Arab scholar had a reason to exist. The ancient entities had a connection to him. The strange rituals had a source. The lost knowledge had an author. And the fictional universe had its own mythology. But Lovecraft went further. He didn't simply mention the book once, he kept returning to it. He gave it a fictional history, an original title, translations, supposed editions, supposed restrictions, and supposed surviving copies. The result was a fictional book that behaved like a historical artifact. And that was the secret. But here's the real genius. The Necronomicon was never really about a book. It was about the fear of knowledge, the fear that somewhere there might be information we were never meant to discover. Lovecraft understood that people are naturally attracted to forbidden things. Tell someone, don't open that door, and suddenly they want to know what's behind it. Tell someone, Don't read this book, and the book becomes irresistible. The less Lovecraft revealed, the more powerful the idea became. He didn't need to write 1,000 pages of terrifying knowledge. He only needed to suggest that those pages existed. The missing information did the rest. And this is why the Necronomicon survived, not because of what was written inside it, but because of what readers imagined might be inside. And now, we have something extremely important: evidence. Because unlike a real historical mystery, we don't have to guess whether the Necronomicon was real. Lovecraft told people it wasn't. In his letters, he openly described Abdul Alhazred and the Necronomicon as inventions. He even explained how he and other writers would create fictional mythology and refer to each other's imaginary books as though they were real. In other words, the deception wasn't a secret. It was a game, a literary game. Lovecraft and his fellow writers were building a shared imaginary world, piece by piece. But something extraordinary happened. The readers didn't always know they were playing the same game. And once the stories entered popular culture, the fictional history began escaping into the real world. This is where the story becomes truly fascinating, because Lovecraft's death did not kill the Necronomicon. Quite the opposite. The mythology continued through other writers, artists, publishers, filmmakers, game designers, musicians, and eventually, the internet. The name Abdul Alhazred began appearing outside Lovecraft's original stories. The Necronomicon became part of popular culture, and every new appearance added another layer to the myth. Some people knew it was fictional. Others played along. Some searched for supposed copies, and others simply wondered, could Lovecraft have based it on something older? Was there perhaps an obscure Arabic manuscript behind the story? Was Abdul Alhazred inspired by a real person? These questions have survived for decades, but the evidence leads us back to the same place: Lovecraft, a writer, a fictional name, and an imagination powerful enough to manufacture history. So, what is the real horror of Abdul Alhazred? It isn't that he was a sorcerer. He wasn't. It isn't that he wrote the Necronomicon. He didn't. It isn't that he discovered Irem or encountered supernatural beings. There is no historical evidence for any of that. The real horror is something much more human. A writer created a fictional man and gave him a convincing history. Then he created a fictional book and gave that book a convincing history. Then he connected both to real places, real historical periods, and real historical figures. And eventually, the fiction became so convincing that people began asking whether the fiction was real. That tells us something about the human mind. We don't always believe things because we have evidence. Sometimes we believe them because the story is good enough. Abdul Alhazred never walked through the streets of Damascus. He never crossed the Arabian desert. He never discovered Irem. He never wrote the Necronomicon. And he never died at the hands of an invisible creature. Because Abdul Alhazred never existed. But here's the paradox. A man who never existed left a legacy. A book that was never written became famous. A city that belonged to legend became part of modern horror. And a name invented by a child became the name of one of fiction's most infamous occultists. Perhaps that is the true power of storytelling. A sufficiently convincing story doesn't need to be true to become part of our reality. And perhaps that's why, more than a century later, people still search for the Necronomicon, still ask about Abdul Alhazred, still wonder whether there was something hidden behind the story. But there wasn't. There was only H. Lovecraft, a writer who understood one terrifying truth. Sometimes, the most powerful monster isn't the one you create. It's the one you convince people might be real. The man was fictional, the book was fictional, the history was fictional, but the legend became real.